Good evening, my friends, with my big, deep, booming voice. If you'd like to grab a seat, that would be amazing. So my name's Jon Alexander. I am a Conduit member and the host of this series of events, How to Save Democracy. Small question, becoming slightly more urgent, as you may have noticed. But this event series also feeds into a podcast of the same name that I co-host with a Tunisian woman called Omazine Khalifa, who was an activist in the Arab Spring and then became a politician in Tunisia. And we've been exploring over the last year or so through these events and then podcast episodes some of the most innovative and exciting approaches to renewing democracy, actually, not just saving it. I think that the core sort of hypothesis of the work is that you don't defend what we have, you evolve and make it deeper and stronger and better. And so that theme is going to continue this evening as we go into a conversation about rewriting the rules, which I was going to call constitutional crowdsourcing, and then that terrified even me. But that is kind of where we're going. It's like, and the reason for that is an argument, and I guess the hypothesis that we're inviting you into this evening is, what if this is a moment politically and in our democracies that is so severe that actually it isn't just about electing someone slightly less bad or someone slightly less good, it's about the rules of the game. And when I'm talking about this in my sort of classic 1990s taxi driver test, the way I often use the metaphor of a football match, and I say to people, like, if you think of it in that sense, this isn't necessarily just about getting slightly better players on a team, nor is it even about getting a better team. It's actually about the rules of the game being broken, that power is too far away from actually all of us. And that is the sort of the hypothesis that will invite you into this evening, is like, if that is the case, then what do we do about it? Is there anything we can do? And this evening, what I've sort of curated together for this conversation is people to help us understand and explore how we actually might be able to do that. We, as the citizens, not necessarily asking someone to do it for us or asking for permission to do it. And so that's where we're going to invite you. We'll step back and have a think about that and challenge that premise if we want to. That's up to you. There will be, after we've had a little bit from, I'll say in a minute, the flow of the evening, but after we've had a bit of conversation, there will be an opportunity where we get you to chat to one another and then hear some soundings from the room. I'm not intending that to be a classic Q&A. We want to hear what you're thinking. And then we'll give our panelists a chance to sort of give closing thoughts. But the way we're going to do the evening is we'll start off by hearing from, you're right at the beginning. Well done, you. You guys are right at the beginning of a new campaign called Our House, which is looking to crowdsource a people's charter for the future of UK democracy, learning from the lessons of our history and the Chartists, which you will hear more about in just a moment. We're going to hear a bit about that as a bit of opening stimulus for the evening. Then we'll invite you to say hello to one another. And then we will go into our panel where we'll learn lessons from the crowdsourcing of Mexico City's constitution and the attempted crowdsourcing of Iceland's constitution, where we can learn lessons both from frustration and from process and from success and from possibility. So that is the plan for the evening. Does that feel all right? Yeah! And there are people on live stream who are probably seeing about the top of my head. Hello, people on live stream. We are going to, I'll do a little invite for you guys, but we're going to start by hearing, as I say, from Mr. Oli Whittington, who is the initiator of the Our House campaign. Oli.
Thank you, Jon. Yeah, it's great to be here tonight and a part of this conversation. I'm Oli Whittington. I'm a participatory democracy practitioner and founder and co-lead of Our House, the movement building people's charters for a democracy that works for everyone. I'm especially excited to be a part of this conversation with two incredible people who've inspired me and have done this work of rewriting, reimagining the rules of democracy and society. This work is urgent. Globally, around the world, we're experiencing the biggest crisis in democracy since the 1930s. And here at home in the UK, our collective freedoms have been restricted. All the while, we have far-right activists, backed by the world's richest man, organising the biggest protest the third largest protest in the last 20 years. These anti-democratic forces are mobilizing around many, many lies, but one truth that is the most potent. People feel powerless. And we've seen from the UN, the US and beyond, that if democracy is on the ballot and democracy means politics as usual, then democracy will lose. But we feel powerless because we still are democratic people. We believe in democratic principles, in freedom of information, freedom of expression, an equal and fair society. It's just the way that we're doing democracy that isn't working. The good news is that there are alternatives, and if you haven't watched this series, then what are you doing? Go and explore, because there's lots of new and old ways of doing democracy that don't just result in better collective decisions, but result in better collective action. And they can create the change that we need in the world right now. And that's from Katie Rubin and Claudia Schwalitz talking about legislative theatre and citizens' assemblies, to Audrey Tang speaking about fast, fun, responsive, digitally enhanced government in Taiwan. So in this threat, we have an opportunity. We can speak to and mobilize around the powerlessness we all feel. We can build a better democracy. And that's my invitation to you all tonight, to join the biggest political imagination project in a generation, to not fight over better policies or better political parties, but to build a better politics. And we're doing that through people's charters. So people's charters are a set of demands and actions for how local and national politics should change. And twice before, people's charters have won us power. They've transformed how power, politics and democracy work in the UK, from the 1800s, where we won the right to vote and the right to be an MP for ordinary people to stand instead of aristocrats, and Charter 88, which won things like Freedom of Information Act and paved the way for devolved nations having their own parliaments. And each time, we didn't just build a better democracy, we built a better and fairer country for everyone. The working week, clean air to breathe, all of these fundamental rights, they're the result of the reimagining and redistribution of power. So in this time of crisis, we need to step back into this tradition once more. We need to build a people's charter and build a democracy that works together. And there's a role for all of us in this room and beyond. So over the next few years, we'll be starting with hundreds of people's charters across the 4 nations. Next year, we'll bring this together into 4 national charters for England, Northern Ireland, Scotland, and Wales. And finally, our growing alliance of political leaders will bring the outside in, carrying the demands into their parties and parliament. But of course, we won't wait for the system to change. We can build and enact this democracy that we need today, right now. And you can take part too. So whether you're a politician, campaigner, part of a local sports club or a faith group, or a local at your pub, this project will be built by millions of people imagining, demanding, enacting the democracy that we need. So we're right at the start of this journey, and you can find out how you want to take part by going to ourhouseuk.org and click Become a Chartist, and you can join the movement, and there's many roles to play. But this isn't a far-off fantasy. The work is very much underway, and that's why I'm super excited to introduce the big head behind me, Billy Dayson, who is the Chartist leader and building the movement in Grimsby. He's also the leader of East Marsh, who set up East Marsh United, and will be sharing a bit about the relevance for this work in Grimsby and beyond.
Hello, I'm Billy from East Marsh United, and I'm addressing the question of a People's Charter. Why now? Well, the 19th century Chartists fought for their demands during an age of great economic upheaval and profound inequality. Does that ring any bells? I'm here to argue that we're living through a similar moment, and that's precisely why the time for a new People's Charter, both in Grimsby's East Marsh and across the UK, is now. Nationally, this charter is driven by a perfect storm of political alienation and economic injustice. We face a severe crisis of trust. Public faith in Parliament and political life is at a near record low. When the system isn't working for the people, its very legitimacy is undermined. We also face an extreme crisis of inequality. The UK has huge income disparity. For millions, working harder no longer guarantees a life free from poverty, a devastating truth that echoes the struggles of the original Chartists 180 years ago. This national sickness is acutely visible right in the East Marsh. We're not statistics. We're a community with specific localised wounds. When the national economy fails, it's places like ours that suffer first and worst. Above all, the original charter was a coming together of local places, which taught us that local control is the key to social change. So the East Marsh needs a charter now, firstly, to reclaim our voice, ensuring local priorities like housing quality, essential services, etc., are addressed by accountable decision makers. Secondly, setting the agenda. We need to guide regeneration and investment so that it benefits us, the people in the community, first and foremost. And finally, to build collective power. The People's Charter will help us transform anger and frustration into constructive collective action. So the moment is right because we've reached a breaking point, politically and economically. The historical Chartists eventually succeeded. Their core ideas became the law of the land. They showed us that the process of demanding change builds the movement and forges the community. So today we take up their mantle. The time is now because the stakes are too high to wait. We must translate our shared anger into a unifying document, a People's Charter, to demand a fair deal, a real voice and a better tomorrow for every forgotten community across our nation. Thank you.
A lot of this idea actually started with Billy getting in touch, I think, with Oli and with me and one or two others and saying, like, this is the moment for a new Chartism. So this is coming up from the communities in this country very genuinely. They're not statistics, we're not statistics, but people with real localised wounds. I think there's such a powerful bit of language there. So we're going to get the panel up in just a moment, but before we do, the spirit of these events is that to get into a conversation. So what we want to do is give you a chance to say hello to someone you haven't met yet. So the invitation is to turn to someone you don't know and just share a bit of your reason for being here and maybe a few reflections on what you've heard so far before we get into the conversation. Over to you for a couple of minutes. Okay, my friends, I hate to interrupt conversations, but you're going to get a chance to go back into them very soon, I promise you. If you can see me, raise your hand and close your mouth. If you can see me, raise your hand and close your mouth. Oh, I only needed to do it twice. Usually it takes 3 times. That's the rule, just in case you need that for a little tip in quietening people down in any way. So let's get into a bit more of this conversation. Like, is this a constitutional moment? Is this a moment where we have to rewrite the rules? If it is, how do we do it? I think we'll start with if it is, how do we do it? And then we'll come back and ask a bit more of the question, because there are some seriously exciting projects and pieces of work from recent history on this stage before you. I'll just introduce the people I've got. So you've met Oli Whittington already, participatory designer, who's worked on everything from urban transformation to how we fund social change, and is now the lead initiator of the Our House campaign with an amazing team of human beings. To his left, the wonderful Gabriella Gomez Mont. We have some true Latin energy on the stage. Founder and director of Experimentalista, a novel type of nomadic and creative office specialised in cities. And also the former chief creative officer of Mexico City. There you go, my friends. Can we have a little wiggle for that, Gabriella? We were discussing wiggles earlier and how there aren't enough wiggles in London events. And founder of the Laboratory for the City, Laboratorio para la Ciudad, from 2013 to 2018, and reporting directly to the mayor, doing all sorts of amazing things that you really need to know about. But tonight you're only going to hear about the crowdsourcing of Mexico City's constitution. Boom. And finally, just to my right here, the lovely Smari McCarthy, a wonderful name, I always think, I apologise, but the first line of Smari's bio says Icelandic Irish, and I think you can, Smari McCarthy, there we go. So Smari is, I like to think of Smari as kind of the original political pirate. Serial democratic innovator, co-founded the Shadow Parliament Initiative, the Icelandic Digital Freedom Society, the Icelandic Modern Media Initiative, now doing some very interesting work around international security, but perhaps most significantly for this evening in particular, one of the co-founders of the Icelandic Pirate Party, for whom he was an MP from 2016 to 2021, and the motivating force behind which was actually, and I hadn't realised this until we were talking earlier, was actually the story of the Icelandic constitution. So look at that, my friends. Look what you've got in front of you. So we're going to start, as I say, by sort of setting slightly aside the what is this moment. We might come back to that. And just understand what's possible. And I'm going to start with you, Smari, and just give us a sense, first of all, maybe of why the Icelandic process happened. Land us in that moment. Some of you may remember, if you recall, sort of the late 2000s and the great financial crisis, and particularly remember that moment when Iceland hit all of our headlines, right? But imagine being there in that place in that time. Smari, just take us back there and give us the sense of where this came from.
Yeah, all right. So basically, roughly over a 2-week period in late 2008, Iceland lost about 17/18 of its economy, and that was...
Sorry, 17/18.
Yeah, I mean, like, a lot of it was magic money that only existed in banks, and most of it was banks lending other banks, which then lent the money back, and so it was all inflated and magical and nonsensical, but, you know, that I believe that's roughly the right ballpark figure. And what essentially happened there, you know, in the aftermath of that was, you know, people first panicked because, you know, our country was in crisis. We had a government collapse, we had protests, we had basically a year of political upheaval. We got in a new government that was very much trying to clean up the mess, but, you know, as things kept progressing, things, you know, more and more of the nonsense became more well known. The degree to which the deregulation of the banking system had motivated this, the way in which abuses of power had been rampant and had been facilitating the conditions by which the economy could eventually collapse. And this led to a lot of people starting to think, hang on, we have this constitution that, you know, when it was originally adopted under the, you know, when Iceland became a democratic republic in 1944, there was an understanding that it should be rewritten no later than 1945, which then never happened. There were a bunch of modifications that were made in the years after, most notably the adoption of the European Human Rights Convention of Human Rights in '92. But aside from that, there were no fundamental changes made to the way that the country was organized. But the 1944...
From 1844?
Well, yeah, 1880.
1884.
Yeah, so basically, Iceland had been a Danish colony, and there had been an Icelandic independence movement that had basically demanded a constitution. Finally, when one was made, it was made more for the purposes of Danish bureaucrats than it was for the Icelandic people. And we still have that legacy baked into our system. So 2009, people started saying, hang on a minute, maybe we should reform this, maybe we should restructure this, maybe we should do something different.
The rules of the game need rewriting.
Precisely. And so there were various groups that started talking about this. Antil Collective is probably the most famous of them.
And where were you at this time? What were you doing?
I was living on the island of Vestmannaeyjar, a small island off the south coast where I actually grew up. And I was running a fab lab. I was doing digital fabrication, 3D printers and stuff. But every weekend I'd go to Reykjavik and participate in protests and things like that. And actually, so for a chunk of 2009, I was working in Afghanistan. And I remember one particular instance in August when there was, I was sitting in Jalalabad watching a live stream from Reykjavik where there were crazy protests going on, people burning down things outside the parliament building, and I was like I'm missing all the fun, right? So, but what
I'm in sensible, stable Afghanistan. Perfect.
Yeah, right. I mean, yeah, it was complete nonsense the entire time. But what was catalyzing at that point in time was, more and more people saw the need for this change. And there were groups that were starting to organize events. Eventually, there was I think it was a 1,500 person randomly chosen sortition event, which kind of tried to capture what are the values of people in Iceland, given everything that's just happened. And that then...
Sorry, just to underline that, 1,500 people randomly selected.
Which, remember, this is Iceland. It's 400,000 people today. 1,500 people is a substantial proportion of our population, right?
And brought together and had a deliberated with one another and came to a set of...
Exactly. Over 2 days, they went through a process which generated a bunch of ideas, a bunch of values, concepts for what Iceland should be as a nation in the aftermath of this collapse. And on the basis of that, this new government that had taken over to kind of deal with the aftermath of the collapse, they said, hang on, okay, there's a lot of calls for a constitutional reform, and now we see this process which could play out. So they did a very smart thing, which was they decided to follow the same format and get another, I can't remember the number correctly, but on the order of 1,500 people together for a weekend of, let's talk about what our constitution should say. What should it be? And then the results of that got handed over to what was eventually a elected group of 23, I think it was, members of a constitutional assembly, whose job it was to take all of this input, plus input from stakeholders in society, and write a new document, right? A proposal for a constitution.
And how were the 23 identified?
Through a direct election, which was so it went, and there's a little wrinkle in this story that, they were elected directly through a single transferable vote election. But then the Supreme Court struck down the election on the basis that there had been 6 very minor violations of the election law. One of them was that the booths in which some people were voting only reached about 2 meters up instead of all the way to the ceiling. those are the same booths that have been used in every parliamentary election for years. Like, this was completely a non-issue, especially because very few people are more than 2 meters or 2.5 or whatever. So, like, the ability to see over the tops of these booths was negligible, right? So it was completely nonsensical. Nobody really doubted the veracity of the election itself. So the government decided to appoint the same people as would have won the election if the election had been fair, to a new council that would do the same work. It's like, yeah.
Like, just help us understand, like, is that a first instance of some sort of establishment pushback or kind of resistance to the process?
Precisely. And, well, not the first instance, but maybe the most significant at that point. So all throughout this process, even from the, when people started talking first about reacting to the economic collapse, the Conservative Party in particular, but also just conservative forces within society.
Small c conservative, yeah.
Yes, yeah. Not the same party as here, but yes. So that death cult, broadly, started pushing back against any ideas of reform and trying to spike the process by undermining any legitimacy, drawing into question any the right to even consider constitutional reform. And then when the this lawsuit was somewhat frivolous, but it got to the Supreme Court and got struck down on these technicalities, which, okay, technically they were true violations, but this had never been brought up in other elections. So
So you have the set of principles that's come from 1,500 out of 400,000, 350,000 people.
Yeah.
You have a kind of mandate. Government is sort of supportive, and then you have this 23-member appointed council / elected group.
Exactly.
And so what happens then?
They wrote a fantastic document, and they took a lot of input from the public. The document was not completely without flaws, but it was good. This was then delivered to the Parliament.
Can you give us a flavour of one or two of the sort of key characteristics?
So, well, for instance, one of the things that's been a problem in the current constitution for a very long time is that there's no clear distinction between where presidential powers end and the government's powers begin. So this was actually fleshed out properly. There's also a lot of good language put in around the information rights of the public and the rights of the public to demand referendums, and for the Parliament to settle disagreements by having binding referendums, or so casting issues from the Parliament to the public.
So this feels really important to me, and in the scheme of these events and the How to Save Democracy series, we're kind of really digging into this thing of, I've described it in the root of my work. I've wrote a book called Citizens and talk about the shift from consumer to citizen as the story of the individual in society. And within that, this idea that what we've got today, a kind of consumer democracy where people's only agency is to choose between a fixed set of options every few years and then choose who to give your power to and then leave it with them, as it were, is not going to be able to give us answers to the challenge of our times. And what we need, sort of underlying thing that we're working with in this podcast, in this series, this idea of a citizen democracy where actually we're involved on a much more dynamic basis in shaping what the decisions are and what the options are, not just in choosing between them occasionally.
Yeah.
And those sorts of mechanics are in this constitutional proposal.
Lots of those kinds of mechanics. And I'd say, underlying the information aspect, you cannot make good decisions on the basis of no information or bad information. So it isn't just the importance of allowing people to make decisions, call for make initiatives, call for referenda. It's also the importance of being able to get information from the government about what it is that's going on, so that you can make the good decisions in the first place. And well, so yeah. And
it's been independently reviewed, I believe, that this constitutional draft as being quite a punchy thing.
Yeah, it's and there is the question of, like, it was quite a progressive, maybe too progressive by some people's measure, but not mine, as a document. But it was there was a question, and it was a very valid question, of whether the document was representative of what the country was or what people in the country wanted it to become. And this is always the balance when you're doing this kind of process, because you might not have the opportunity to redo this process until many decades later. And as we see with the current constitution, it represents a country that fundamentally no longer exists. Technology has changed, the people have changed, we're no longer a colony, right? And so, since you don't know when you're going to be able to do this reform again, you need it to be at least a little bit aspirational in order to capture what you hope will become the zeitgeist of whatever the next few decades might be.
Okay, so we've got a sense of what's in this. There's a much more kind of participatory society being conceptualized and having the rules formulated for it. We've had this really quite participatory process where you have a group of people who are much more porous and and you were on the outside kind of feeding into that.
Yeah, I was not, so I did stand as a candidate for this original 23-person group, but I didn't win. Not surprising, but I did suggest language and contribute to the process in various ways, just as an interested, concerned citizen. And some of the exact wording that I suggested got adopted into the final document, which I thought was amazing, like really cool. Would have been even cooler if it had gone through, but
so let's get there then. So amazing constitution could have been a new framework, and then
so once this was handed into the Parliament, so there had been an argument that according to the current constitution, only the Parliament can change the constitution. They wanted there to be a referendum, but the referendum was argued that they would have to have it non-binding. And this, of course, was primarily argued by the people who didn't want this to go through in the first place. And in addition, the questions that were asked in this referendum, it was 6 questions. The first was whether the public would want this document to serve as a draft for a new constitution. Not whether it should serve as a new constitution, but just whether it should be a draft. And that's already undermining the outcome by just poor language. And then the other questions were trying to clarify certain things about like separation of church and state, whether there should be all votes should be weighted equally around the country. I mean, pretty hard to argue against that, but but all these questions were clarifying things that the Parliament considered the Constitutional Assembly to not have done a good enough job about. Fair enough, right? If they're going to be putting their grubby fingers on it anyway, they might as well do it to some benefit, right? Except, of course, the outcome of this vote was every single aspect of that referendum was also used to call into question the legitimacy of the document. And ultimately what happened was the Conservative Party, Independence Party they're called.
What was the result of the referendum?
It's almost 70% in favour of the adopting it, and all of the statements were adopted with resounding yeses, except one where the language was flipped around in a weird way. But yeah, so exactly the outcome that.
So we've also got massive public endorsement of this thing.
Yeah, and and one of the things that was called into question was that it was only a 50% turnout. Now, 50% turnouts are pretty terrible in Iceland, but they're pretty par for the course, or even pretty good in a lot of countries. But so this needs to be taken into the context of most elections in Iceland have between 65 and 80% turnout, but at the same time, they are binding. When you have a parliamentary election, presidential election, those are binding. This was a non-binding election which had been spoken ill of and undermined from day one, and it was about a relatively weird niche issue. I mean, constitutional law is not a kind of, it's not like football. It's not it's not the thing that everybody feels that they have an opinion on. So the fact that we still had 50% turnout, or just under 50%, is still kind of remarkable. And should, if anything, that is an endorsement of the process rather than the opposite. But yeah, so in the aftermath of this, the Independence Party continued to filibuster, obstruct, prevent this from going through, and have continued to do that to this day. Even in the government before the current one, there had been an effort by the then Prime Minister, who was from the Left Green Party, to try and get some kind of movement on the constitutional issue going, even if it was just a token thing to get the ball rolling. And she was the Prime Minister in this government, but it was a government coalition with the two parties that had been most opposed to the process. And of course, the outcome was nothing happened. So, if anything, I'd say that this entire process tells us that, you can do this kind of public participation. You should do this public participation, but you need to make sure that there aren't all of these opportunities for specific people or parties or groups in society to undermine and delegitimize the process, either by putting in guardrails and just providing legal armor for the process, or trying to figure out a way of either getting them on board willingly or unwillingly, but so that they at least find that they have to go through the process themselves. And since that didn't happen, here we are with still the same old 1870s rag.
And if I'm right, technically in the state where a constitutional proposal has been made in 2012 and is technically sort of still in the ratification process.
Yeah. Yeah.
And just before I sum this up and turn to Gabriella, just tell us about the relationship of this to the Pirate Party in your own.
Well, how to do the short version of this? So by 2012, me and various other people of a kind of somewhat activist but very liberal bent in society in Iceland had come to the conclusion that one of the big problems that we had at the time was that most of the political arena in Iceland at the time was more kind of traditionalist or conservative as opposed to liberal. There were some that were more progressive and some more left-wing, and others that were more right-wing and more conservative. But what was missing was a progressive element that was willing to fight for these kinds of and liberal element that would fight for these kinds of reforms. And we didn't see any other party that was willing to take up that mantle. So we got together and because we were very much inspired by the information politics movements from Sweden and to a lesser extent Germany in the pirate parties, we decided to copy their baseline and use that as a starting point. But we did make the very important distinction that I think carried the Pirate Party early on quite far, of saying, unlike the Swedes, we did not want to be a single issue party. We did not want to be too focused just on the information politics, but rather, much like Social Democrats started off as a welfare-based party and then expanded to cover all topics of human society, and Greens started as environmentalists and then added feminism and other things and then gradually expanded to every corner. We wanted to do the same with information politics at our core. And but moving the constitution forward was the one of the big driving forces in that, which is why we kept proposing it and kept making it our condition for participating in anything. Not that that got us anywhere.
So I'm going to just draw a couple of things out of that and then turn to you, Gabriella. But what we've got is I think I want to focus first on the kind of the possibility of a process that can involve a huge amount of people, like a 1,500 person randomly selected gathering for 2 days, creating a meaningful output that structures a national conversation. I think is a really, it's beyond anything I've heard about before, and very, very powerful. And then this elected council, and if I'm right, the condition of the election was it wasn't politicians, it was people outside of politics.
So technically anybody could run, but there was a limitation of like no sitting members of parliament.
Yeah.
So the president was not like, so they could have resigned.
Right.
We kind of wish some of them had.
But so you have this group of people that's then acting very porously, and people could see their own words in this document, and that is all possible.
Yeah.
We can do that kind of crowdsourcing. And then there's this thing about, okay, how does it actually get integrated into power? And that feels like a key lesson is you got to pay a lot of attention to that, because for the rules to change, to actually be shifted, there are going to be an awful lot of forces, left and right, on the existing political spectrum definitions that are not going to be excited about that.
You need to make the process absolutely bulletproof. And like there's like an Ian Fleming quote of like, once is happenstance, twice is coincidence, and 3 times is enemy action. You know, you need to start treating this kind of thing, and whether constitutional law or democratic processes, as things that are subject to attacks by people who want to undermine them and want to destroy either democracy as a whole or some aspect of it, or just a country or some polity, right?
So from a country of 400,000 people, we turn to a city of what, 16 million?
22 million.
All right, fine. You have your 20 million. And Gabriella, if you could take us in a similar way, like what was the driving force behind this happening, and when are we talking? And I gather that you looked at Iceland as one of your inspirations.
Absolutely. So the first thing to say before I start is I lost my voice some days ago, and no amount of mezcal has been able to fully cure it, so please bear with me. My voice might go weird at some point in time. And the second thing to say, if anybody here had told my pre-government self that I'd be here waxing poetic about constitutions when I was still dedicated to arts and culture, I would have thought that was madness, and yet here we are. So thank you for sharing these strange pleasures along with me, because it is somewhat of a fascinating thing. One of the things that I learned about constitutions is that they're such interesting creatures because they're both a document of political imagination, of who we want to be as a society, and they are also our highest rights. So it is the marriage of two of the things that are incredibly important to me nowadays that I'll get into for a second. But first, I want us to do an exercise of both time travel as well as teletransportation. So imagine right now, has anybody been to Mexico City, by the way? Any raised hands? Okay, so not that many people. But so we will imagine for a second that we will teletransport to another megalopolis in the world, Mexico City, 22 million people, metropolitan area. 10 million people, city proper. Just kids under 14 is 500,000 people, so that's like an Iceland of just kids under age 14 to just like get a bit of a sense of a scale. And we will land in 1985. And it is 8 o'clock in the morning, and here we are here gathered together, and suddenly we're going to start seeing the lamps trembling around us, and everything will start moving and shaking, and everybody will fall into somewhat of a panic because we are a place of big earthquakes. Once the earthquake has subsided, fortunately nothing has happened, though there's somewhat of a havoc in here. We start filing out, and since we're in the city center, very much like London here, suddenly we figure out that there's buildings that have fallen down all around us. News starts coming out, there's more than 10,000 people, these are the official numbers that are died, and the city center and the neighborhood where I've lived most of my adult life, Condesa, Roma, they're completely devastated. At that point in time, Mexican politics played a very important role in this critical moment, and crises are a big moment, absolutely, of renewal and of rewriting the rules. We had a president who was from the PRI, who had been in power, I think, for that time, like 60 years. They called it the perfect dictatorship just because we had elections and we pretended we had a democracy, but things were set up in a way that no opposition could actually come into power. And what happened with the city devastated was that suddenly the president disappeared on us. He was not, that political leader that we needed at the moment was completely disappeared, even though Mexico City is a seat of power, both of local as well as national powers. So what happened at the moment is potentially the most important thing that has happened, not only to Mexico City, but I dare say Latin America, because Mexico City showed the way for a lot of cities and countries throughout Latin America, was that citizens started organizing. And this meant, first of all, organizing, like a very important outfit that still exists to this day. The topos were born. of people that were experienced obreros, construction workers that were very thin. We're helping to get people out of the rubble because of the lack of a proper government response. We had moms making sandwiches and distributing them throughout the city. So I can just tell you that this was a month, like I was a kid at the time, but I still remember us making in the kitchen and going out and distributing. This was the birth of civil society in Mexico, proper, organized social movement that ended up doing everything from housing to food justice to, very important here, we started thinking, how the hell is it that we don't have a locally elected mayor when we are the seat of power? We're 20% of the GDP and 20% of the population. How the hell do we not have political representation here? What the hell is this? So a big momentum started. It was also the origin of the left-wing parties getting a lot of power. And so basically a referendum was made where we asked people, do we need an officially elected mayor? And the big answer was, of course, yes. So in 2097, we started our first locally held elections. And to this date, 2025, Mexico City has always and forever had only left-wing leaning progressive mayors. So this is a bit the context. And now we're going to go to 2016. Fast forward to when I was in government, I was Chief Creative Officer of Mexico City, as John said at the time. We had really cool titles, huh? Like the Pirate Party, Chief Creative Officer.
The story of how Gabriella became that is a whole other story, but we will tell it one day.
Yeah, that'll leave for another time.
We'll have to skip it for today.
But just to say that the lab was actually set up as 20 people, 20 of us that came from mostly civil society, half of us from the humanities, half of us from the political urban sciences, and I reported directly to the mayor, and we were very much there for both experimental practices as well as the participatory layer of government. So imagine that you are now with me and you suddenly wake up one morning, and I was reading the newspaper, I usually do, and suddenly I see my name mentioned in an announcement of the mayor saying like, yes, and Laboratorio para la Ciudad, which I ran, will be helping create the participatory layer of the Mexico City Constitution. And I was like, what? What Constitution? What is happening here? And this was not the first time that this has happened, but this really, when I started finding out more details, became music to my ears, because this was precisely what had been asked for since '97. We wanted to have independence. Mexico City is a city-state of sorts. We don't have a governor. So the metropolitan, the geopolitical borders and the geographical borders are one and the same. And the mayor is nowadays, for all intents and purposes, the second most important politician. But there were so many things that we were still beholden in terms of our political prowess to the national government. So this had been a push and a demand from way back in the day. And the mayor was actually able to negotiate. And I'm getting to the point right now, but tell me, you have a question.
No, I was just going to say, just to be clear, so from 1985 and the earthquake, there's this sense that Mexico City doesn't have its own, the people of Mexico City don't have their own rules, don't have a say in setting their own rules, and don't have representation. And then the mayor comes in, but this is like the completion of that process.
Absolutely, and the Constitution is it is what gave us an updated sense of autonomy vis-a-vis the national government. And this was both political power, but it was also citizen power, just because Mexico City owes its incredibly progressive right to social power, to social movements very precisely, which have been like with blood and sweat throughout the years. So this was an incredibly important moment. And so basically what happened at that point in time was that the backdoor negotiations ended up being that the mayor had to say yes, that the Constitutional Assembly would be 60% elected by Mexico City folks, and 40% would be designated by the representation of the different parties in the National Congress. So the activists that had been working on this were furious, like absolutely furious with this. Like, what the hell? We've never voted for the right-wing party here, and suddenly we're gonna have an overrepresentation of the right? So basically what the mayor had to do was two things, of saying, we will actually, instead of just saying, go ahead and do your job to the Constitutional Assembly, he promised that we would prepare a document in Mexico City where we actually drew, if you will, a charter for the people that was about who we have been as a city, who we wanted to become, and very much spoke to the DNA of Mexico City, as well as was able to take onto constitutional level a lot of the things that Mexico City was already known for in terms of incredibly progressive rights, potentially some of the most progressive in all of the continent. So basically, here came two things. One of them, a group got created, similar to yours, but not through democratic processes, of 28 people that were chosen by the mayor, that were actually a fabulous group that everybody had to be kind of silent on, even though it was chosen by the mayor, because these were political figures from 97, like, you know, who ended up being the first mayor of Mexico City, to the woman that was the first gay marriage in the history of Mexico City, to a person with disabilities, to an absolutely extraordinary writer who's also incredibly political and progressive in his ideas. And so that is more or less the makeup of Mexico City, not in its entirety, but a big makeup. There was, you know, a thing of saying, okay, done. But there was still a lot of critique on the 40-60, so then that's actually when the mayor came to us and said, we need to involve normal citizens. Like, we need to make a case of why this is important to the day-to-day life of a city, and why this thing that seems to be completely abstract and incredibly technical is actually something that should speak deeply to the heart and to the life of absolutely everybody in this megalopolis. So basically, we started our research. We had 2 months to do everything. Iceland was definitely a huge inspiration, just first of all because of what you had tried, also as a cautionary tale, because we knew it had not passed. So we went through we became very good at doing crisis management, of saying everything that couldn't go wrong, let's put it down on paper, to scare the hell out of ourselves, definitely, but also to plan forward and say, what do we do when this happens? So we knew that there was gonna be pushback. We knew that people that should be in our favor, such as the people that were complaining about this 40-60, we were probably gonna have against at the beginning. And then we also knew that there were going to be right-wingers that were gonna be after us, as well as the whole process.
Just before you go any further, I just want to underline something you said very quickly, but is really significant. You had 2 months to do this whole thing.
We were Mexican time, runs both ways. It's just like forever and ever, but it's also like we want it yesterday. No, not even tomorrow, like we want it yesterday. So yes, we actually had 2 months. And this is, for better and for worse, so much like, you know, what can I say?
So go on, tell us what happened in those 2 months. Take us into the 2 months.
So basically in those 2 months, first of all, is one of the big things that we wanted to understand is how do we create a participatory scaffolding? Like, this cannot be just one way of having people participate. One of the lessons that we already had 4 years in is that people want to participate in different ways. Like, we think people want to just say, yes, I want to be part of the decisions of every government choice. It's like, that's not true. But there will be people that want to give you 5 minutes. And we knew for a fact that there was also activists and social movements that gave us literally 6 years of their lives, all of the time that I was in government, basically. So how do you create a scaffolding which both bakes into the very process the fact that there's incredibly sophisticated social movement and organizing already happening, that I think are things that, for example, the citizens' assemblies don't take into account. Like, you know, sortition is super important, but it doesn't take into account like the power of social movements that have been doing this for literally decades. And so basically, how do we tap into that? How do we tap into the people that only want 5 minutes? How do we tap into the youth? So we started thinking about the different constituencies that we wanted to speak of, and we created a whole process that was possible. Since we had 2 months, we do something that I wouldn't do again if we had more time, but that was very useful, which was, where are people already congregating on a digital level? And that was change.org. So Change at the moment was run by an amazing guy that came from activism. So I called him up. We had already had meetings for other stuff, and I said, can we use a platform for this? Because it was already the biggest population in most of the world, actually, that was already on change.org. So we thought, there's already people there. How do we use this platform? Not have it be the only one, but let's create with Alejandro a process that not only takes into account the strengths of this, that there's already more than 7 million people on it, like not as individual users, if not as continuous users, which is, you know, basically a big chunk of the Mexico City population, but also takes into account its flaws, that it's just like very quick processes. And to your point, I'm not sure if earlier, of how do we actually translate like citizens' ideas into very sophisticated and nuanced, in this case, like constitutional legal frameworks. So we created a whole thing that if you surpassed 5,000, 10,000, 50,000, you would go through different processes, but that this would be just the beginning of a whole process to make this into constitutional level citizen proposals. So this to say that citizen participation, I found in my 6 years, in and of itself is usually not enough. It needs to be scaffolded very deeply and very sophisticatedly, and then plugged in to the political platform that is already there, taking into account its possibilities and also its flaws.
So you have this structure, and so change.org, for people who might not know it, so it's a platform where people can basically propose something that then is a kind of, people can then sign up to it as a petition, sort of start your own petition
and then
platform.
vote and say yes, and then when it gathers momentum, many times that creates political pressure for people to do something about it, and sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it just like stays there.
And you co-opted this essentially as a platform for people to
As
draft clauses, as one of the platforms for people to draft clauses for the
ideas.
Ideas
This is
for
the
the
city that we
Constitution.
want to see. This is what is important to my heart. This is what I feel that the Constitution should be thinking about. But already our promise from the very beginning is that we, in terms of the lab itself, as well as the, I don't know what the name would be in English, but let's say the legal office of the mayor of the city of Mexico City, we would work together to prepare this for constitutional level legal standing, and then it would be fed back into the 28 notable peoples. And that document, and they were the ones that were congregating the multiple participatory layers that we had, that I'll finish telling you about all of them in a second. And then that document would go off into the Constitutional Assembly. That was the 60-40%, 60% voted popularly, 40% with an overrepresentation of a right-wing party.
So by giving people this, among many mechanics of being directly involved in drafting and contributing to this thing, you create a kind of base and a popular engagement that then sort of enables you to hold to account what the document that is drafted and the sort of final sign-off group.
Absolutely, John. So this was both an exercise in political imagination, but and a sense of ownership, and to make peace with the people that rightly were criticizing the 60-40. But it also became a political pressure, because when you have people from Mexico City already invested in a process, it makes it a lot more difficult for other people to say, oh, it's actually just between parties. Like, no, like this is citizenship.
So this is a part of your strategy to counter the undermining, is to ensure that there's a really clear kind of engagement throughout.
Absolutely.
I'm really conscious of time, but I do want you to be able to sort of finish the story.
So I'll just say very quickly, or maybe I won't go into them, but there were 7 additional different participatory measures, everything from like a urban imaginary survey that just asked people what they hated about the city, what they loved about it, how they imagined the future of the city, that it was statistically representative, and we queried 31,000 people, 1,400 neighborhoods, to actually ways that people could self-organize. And let's say what you will be doing, Oli, if you would have wanted, you would have been able to gather people together, draft a document under specific things with open technology tools. That, since I had a fellowship at MIT at the moment, I convinced somebody to turn an academic tool into a policy tool. And then you could actually say, we're really interested in housing, and then put into that document, and then we had a scaffolding that would keep on feeding it back into what the 28 people were doing, that in turn would go on for it. So just to say, and this is some of it, and I'll get into there's a celebration, there's the conundrums, and then there's also the caveats that I'll get into, I think, in the Q&A. But just the celebration is that this document went off because we had already gathered enough momentum. 84% of the things that we personally were involved in, that were citizen-led, made it into the Constitution. And we lost on things that were like really far out there, quite amazing, but quite far out. The document that the 28 notables, that they were called, turned in, is mostly the document that we now have. And nowadays, we have since 2017, the Mexico City Constitution is our highest law. This is incredibly important, not only because it was a first not only for ourselves, but also for the world in many ways. Urban constitutions are a strange thing. They exist more as people charters many times rather more like people's charters or legal frameworks really than constitutions, because the Mexico City Constitution, it's on par with our national constitution, and because of Article 2 of our national constitution, which is a principle of progressivity, any human right that has been granted in Mexico City Constitution cannot ever be taken back. So those of you who know American politics, Roe versus Wade is not possible anymore in the context of Mexico City. So what does that document spell out? Like, what does it do? It is a beautiful document. The right to the city is basically what brings it all into harmony, if you will. And the right to the city basically says, first of all, that the right to the city is not only is also the right to imagine the city and then make it come true. So this bit of political imagination is baked into it, which I kind of love. But then also, when you speak about rights, it talks about the interdependency of rights, that one right is not more important than the other. The first time in the history of the world that the right to mobility, for example, was baked into a constitution, national or local, was actually the Mexico City one. And you'd think that mobility is a secondary right, but it's actually not. Because when you think about spatial justice, people being able to get to their work, just like a whole thing that I won't get into, but basically there's everything from the right to care, nature rights that are the most progressive in the world for cities right now, to be enacted. That's the interesting thing that I'll get into the caveats, but in terms of the document, it really is a love letter, not only to the Mexico City that we have become, but also to the one that we want to be.
I'm going to ask Oli in a moment just to reflect on what he's heard and what he's drawing for the Our House campaign before we come into give people a chance to discuss and maybe share some questions. We're going to have to be punchier on that than I was kind of hoping, because there's so much richness in this and there's like 15 events to be had here. But just give us a sense, like, can you give us a flavour of like, so this has been adopted. What can you give us just one taste maybe of what's different in Mexico City as a result of this in practice?
So there's things. One of the critiques that was handed over to the Constitution was that it sounded and it read like a Santa Claus list, which basically was too idealistic. But we were speaking about this in this room. It is the nature of constitutions to be idealistic. Like we actually, we need to become polytemporal. Like we need to be in the here and the now and the possibilities of the now. But we also need to go towards the future and make space of who we want to become. So there's things that are to be enacted, like the more than human rights conversation that is happening now. We already have it baked into our constitution and are awaiting secondary laws. So the placeholders are beautiful, but also a caveat in terms that I'll get into. The things that have changed and literally were allowed to change overnight is things like transsexual rights. Like transsexual rights is up in our constitution, and I had a group of young transsexuals visiting me. This literally changed their life from the beginning to the end, because now they have everything from, this is not about morals and these big philosophical questions. This becomes administrative and bureaucratic things where you can have your documents changed into the sex that you want. We have the right to care that then actually went off and created a whole series of processes of thinking about what care economics looks like at the city level that is still progressing and going forward in Mexico City, and this is one of the biggest agendas of the mayor at this moment. And I can go on and on, but you tell me when to
I just want to ask you about the participatory nature of it. So this spirit of the way this process is done, there are now mechanics for participation in the city?
There have always been. So since '97, because we saw how important participation was, Mexico City was one of the first cities to adopt participatory budgeting, for example. So nowadays we have more than $50 million every year for participatory budgets. There are town halls, there are things that mandate that, for example, for indigenous communities, you actually have to go through a whole series of consultation processes. And this is where it becomes really interesting, as Oli and I were speaking in the room, that we need every time more sophisticated participatory scaffolding, because as well, it is also possible to co-opt them. Like, politically co-opted participatory mechanisms. So democracy, first of all, has to be thought of in my book, but I'm biased, like a creative practice. But it also has to think about cities and societies as things that are alive. We don't come to a point of completion. We are never done with democracy. We don't write a constitution and then just like clap our hands and be over with it. We don't bake in participatory methodologies and think that that's the beginning and the end of it. And this is, I think, the biggest need at the moment that I'm seeing is one of my realizations is we do not self-combust into citizens at age 18, which is the legal age. Like before that, we're not citizens. We're this weird, in Mexico at least, there's this weird thing that children are more like owned by their parents. And we can call that very polite things like guardianships, with interesting things like after the Mexican Revolution, a kids syndicate was created by the new government, and it became so powerful that it was shut down, which I find brilliant. But you in theory become a citizen at age 18, but with the technocratic turn, we have lost the pedagogies and just like the muscle of what it actually means that we vote not only for self-interest, but actually we vote ourselves into a collective body. And the city and its future is many times in cities as diverse as Mexico City that has the lowest minimum wage in the whole of Latin America, as one as the former #1 billionaire of the world before the tech bros came along. You know, we need to think that the cities actually are for everybody, which is the right to the city. The city belongs to us all. So how do we keep democracy as something that is alive and never trust that it's just the mechanisms in and of themselves? Because sometimes there's government that don't have proper mechanisms with a lot of political pressure, with a lot of political imagination, with the clarity of saying, government, this is what we want, that actually get further than cities that, or countries that in theory have processes that have been co-opted. So this is, I think, the big democratic turn and the big political imagination turn, is that we need to become invested again and feel compelled to make politics, you know, it's a politics of fascination, if you will, like how, and this was actually the exercise of the lab, is like how, especially a young generation. My team was 28 years old on average, which was at the time the average age of Mexico City. How do you make this fascinating for a new generation? Like, how do we care again?
What a lovely call for a politics of fascination. I love that, and the idea that, I think if I'm right, you're sort of saying that the process of this is almost more important, certainly as important as the outcome, the sort of muscle building of to counter your, or sort of offer another metaphor to your combustion into citizens. The process of this is actually part of becoming citizen. I'm going to hold you, if I may, because I could listen to Gabriella and Smari and all night, and I want to make sure we hear some voices from the room, and then give. So Oli, I'm sorry to hold you. We're going to close with you giving your kind of response and your call to arms. But I'm going to give people just 3 or 4 minutes just to talk to one another. We might overrun very slightly if people are okay with that. Maybe I just want to give people a chance just to turn back to your conversation and just digest, and then we'll hear a few soundings from that. So we're going to give you 3 minutes, hear some soundings, and then we'll close out. So just turn back to the person you were speaking to before and just have 3 minutes in conversation. Sorry, I went for so long. No, it's good. No, it's just like to make sure we get things out. Sorry, there's so much.
No, that's I knew that we'd be short on time. I mean, literally, when they made like, you know, relatively surface level case studies on the Constitution, it's been 5 days of interviews, and not even then do we finish. Right. They're big things, so no worries. I know that you're meeting.
In retrospect, maybe I could have spoken faster.
So this is the thing that I cheat on, and I promised a very dear friend of mine that today I was going to try to speak slowly. Okay. And I failed once again to speak slowly.
Now, folks, I hate to do this so quickly, but I am going to interrupt you because I don't want to overrun too dramatically. But I would love to hear just a few sound bites from your conversations, few questions. So if I just raise my hand and close my mouth, I apologize. There will be time for drinks afterwards, but some people do have to go, and I want you to have a chance. So we're going to have mic to 1 or 2 places. If you'd like to share something from your conversation, do raise your hand. You can go, or give us a question from your conversation. Just here.
Yeah, question really. Seems like this whole process was very progressive leaning, and always people from the right-wing politics are kind of referred as them. And I'm curious what was being done so they would be included at least in proportion to their they're part of their relevant constituency.
Yeah, we'll take 2 more voices from the room, and then we'll come back if we may. Anyone else want to ask a question or share a thought? We'll come to this lady and then just in front of you.
I was wondering, like, how people are pushed to participate. What motivates them? Because, like in Italy, for example, I see a lot of young people that don't have any interest in politics and in participating in anything because they don't believe in it. So, how could people be motivated in taking part? Thank you.
And if you just pass forward to this lady just in front of you, we'll take that voice.
I guess two things that really struck me was like, what are our values now? I think we assume a lot and we don't know. And William Ury talks about this all the time, about looking out on the balcony and seeing what is something that what do we agree on, and what what are they? And the other thing was to bring in the imagination, and I'd love to hear more about the children's coalition, because I just was talking to somebody about that book, King Matt I, and which was all about Poland in just between the world wars, and what if children ruled.
Okay, I'm afraid we're gonna, in the interest of time, and I know there's gonna be so much that comes back on this, but these two really important questions. I think there's this thing about, there has been a sense in the conversation that it feels quite left, and that's not necessarily right. So can we voice that a little bit, and then this idea of like, that just speaking into what motivates people, like is there this perception people don't want to be involved actually, and maybe we can just and maybe Gabriella, you can share a brief more word on the children's element as well. But I'd love Smari and Gabriella just to reflect on both of those things, the sort of left versus right tension and the starting point. Do people care? Do people want to be involved in this kind of thing? So Gabriella, maybe I'll go you first, and then
Sure,
I'm going to come to Oli who's been sitting listening carefully to tell us what he's taking.
So I think in a moment of political divisiveness, this becomes an incredibly relevant question that I will answer from my own personal experience, as well as the composition, if you will, of the DNA of Mexico City. So one of the things that happened when I stepped into the lab is that one of my counterparts in Boston told me, don't get into politics. Like, it's too messy. And then a week in, literally, I found there's nothing that we can do that is not political. So I decided to wear our politics on the sleeve. We wanted to speak openly and succinctly about the type of society, the type of values, the type of city that we believed in, and how we were working towards that. In terms of Mexico, that I won't speak for any other country, but I will say this in the context of Mexico. When we did all of these participatory scaffoldings, we actually put into place a caveat of saying, in the moment that we get a change.org petition that says that you want to abolish gay marriage, or that you don't want this or that, we're not even gonna read it. It's not even gonna be a contender. And why is this? Because there's one thing that I think has been important in the history of human rights, which is we cannot have majorities voting on minority rights. The right that Mexico City protects, if you are right-leaning and do not want to have an abortion, or do not want to have a trans operation, or do not want to be in a gay marriage, is that you do not have to do it. And Mexico City is there to protect the rights that do want to, as long as it doesn't messes with anybody else's way of being in a city. So in a certain sense, the interesting thing is that it's not a perfect equation, but many times the left wing is actually what we would call in feminist history intersectional. You are looking out for not only your rights, but the rights of others. So instead of going against other people's rights, you're actually creating concentric circles of possibilities for people to engage politically and deeply in terms of making a life which is sovereign and which is autonomous and which can actually choose who you love and choose if you are actually uncomfortable in the body you were born in. And this, I think, and to be honest, I'm still completely shocked that this is up for debate. Like, I think this should be the society everywhere. And the beautiful thing about the right is that when it got to constitutional level, there was already so much work being done on so many levels that the right-wing parties voted for these things as well. So it became controversial, but there was suddenly an acknowledgement of saying, and not the super religious, super right-wing, like, far right, I think is a whole different conversation, but there was already a conversation of saying, we need to represent more people's rights instead of less people's rights. And again, your right to choose not to get married to to be in a same-sex marriage. So I think that's the first most important thing, and we did put very purposely, and we spoke about that very openly, and there were angry people, and to this day I will defend it literally with all of my heart. I don't care if there's somebody that wants to take away people's rights. That's not what constitutions are there for. The second question, in terms of how you get people to participate, that's such a good question, and it has to do with political imagination. When we created the lab, since we were supposed to be in between, that was the first experiment. Will we make a completely angry, not apathetic, because a lot of things were happening, but apathetic towards government, which is a different thing, society want to collaborate with us. And one of the things that we learned is you speak the language of citizens, you speak the language of what they care about instead of the bureaucratic governmental language. We just saw this in New York. What a week to be talking about citizen participation. I mean, and this is precisely what Mandani said. We talk about the apathy of the youth, but really what we need are stories that we want to be part of. And we need to speak the language of youth, and we saw that with the Constitution, where I didn't say this, but we had more than 500,000 people participating in different levels. We had that when we did the first Data Festival, where we had 1,004 people. 4,000 people helped us to crowdsource the Mexico City informal bus, and I can go on and on and on of you create a juicy story and people will come. People do want to participate, but they want to see themselves reflected when in those stories. And the kids one, I'll leave as a caveat just because I don't know enough about it, and every time I say this, I think I need to research it more deeply. But that was actually one of the agendas of the lab, was how do we actually involve kids a little bit more deeply within politics, and again, not wait for us to self-combust into members of society when we turn 18.
I love that. If you build a juicy enough story, then people will want to be part of it. We had a thing, I used to run a consulting business called the New Citizen Project, and we had this founding question. It was, why is consumption made so creative and energetic and participation so goddamn boring? And that was sort of the animation thing. Thank you for that. Smari, your thoughts?
All right. I agree with everything you've said. You're amazing. And, I thought I loved Mexico City before, but now even more so. I won't take too much time, but a couple of things. First off, I agree. Human rights, absolutely non-negotiable. If that's ever a negotiating position of anybody, then they're not worthy of participating in a conversation. But that kind of comes to your question about, or your point about right-wing people. When I was in Parliament, I was accused by the left wing of being right-wing and by the right wing of being left-wing. And I was like, you guys just go find a room, talk it out, come back to me and tell me what you want me to be. Because at the end of the day, I don't care about left-wing or right-wing. What I care about is I'm anti-authoritarian, I'm anti-conservative. Why? Because authoritarians and conservatives have always held society back, have always prevented progress, and have, in fact, promoted stagnation. And that stagnation will kill societies. In fact, it frequently has. Sometimes quite literally, there are entire societies that no longer exist on Earth because of that kind of attitude. And then sometimes, they've just caused a lot of people to die unnecessarily. And that's even just taking some of the cases. So I say we need to have a liberal mindset. And you can be a liberal right-wing person and a liberal left-wing person. And I think both sides, economically or socio-politically, have different arguments in their favor. What we need to do is get beyond that dichotomy and just agree that progress needs to be made because there's still people suffering in the world and there's work to be done, and stagnating as a society is not okay, right? And from there I go into the question about how do you get people to want to participate? Well, part of it is, like I mentioned, I grew up on a very small island. And 4,000 people, 10 million birds, 2 volcanoes, right? It's a bit of a weird place. But because there's so few people, and because the vast majority of them are small c conservative, right wing, then suddenly there's an entire category of opinions you're not really allowed to hold if you come from there. Now, I'm some kind of weirdo who just doesn't really pay attention to that. But there are real consequences for a lot of people, and people have been driven out of that kind of community, not just my home island, but small communities everywhere. And so I agree with your point about creating the fascination, creating something that's worth campaigning against or for, but we also need to recognize that sometimes people are demotivated from political participation because doing so, participating, would be a risk to their existence one way or the other. And we need to somehow make it so that there is no negative side effect to choosing to participate, right? So yeah, I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much. There's some really powerful thoughts in there. Just before I hand to Oli to kind of close us out, just to say a little word about the How to Save Democracy series and the ideas underneath, and maybe to just share one light reflection into this. Some of the sort of inspiration for this, and I will admit to I'm no longer a member of any political party in this country. When I was a member of the Liberal Democrats, and the reason was that Paddy Ashdown in 1989 wrote a book called Citizens Britain, A Radical Agenda for the 1990s, in which he actually talked about participatory democracy and all of these sorts of and rights and all of these sorts of things. And his core idea was he juxtaposed two possible futures. One was Citadel Britain, where Britain retreats behind the English Channel, where power becomes centralised, where the police become a militarised arm of state. And Citizens Britain, and his line, which I loved, and which is basically the reason why I thought that might be a vehicle for this sort of work in the world, was where people's homes in all their messy diversity are the true centres of power. And I loved that line so deeply. And that is much more the sort of spirit that we're exploring with this How to Save Democracy. What is it for people's homes in all their messy diversity to be the true sense of power? We have gone into people, worked with people, talked to people who would conceive of themselves as right-wing. Weirdly, Audrey Tang, the Taiwanese digital minister, calls herself a conservative anarchist. I really want to introduce her to Smari and see what happens there. We've just released an episode on the Irish Citizens' Assembly, which is a nationally representative sample of the population deliberating on all sorts of issues and contributing to legislation on these things, including political affiliation and the representation. So there are episodes and ideas that we're kind of playing with that go into all these sorts of aspects. Please do check out How to Save Democracy. Please do come to the next event here on the 1st of December, where we will be going deep dive into Birmingham, where Indy Johar, the radical architect Indy Johar, and the amazing Imandeep Kaur have been doing some really pioneering work around a project called Civic Square. Learning deeply from them, and do check out the podcast online. And with that, I'm going to invite Oli to share his mind-blown reflections on what he's heard and leave you with a call to arms to get the hell involved in our house. Oliver Whittington.
Thank you. What a daunting job. It's incredible discussion. I want to speak quickly to the political party piece, because I think it's important to mention that people, even the people that are excited about voting for Reform or the Green Party, have this same aching feeling right now that we cannot trust this system. And it's some kind of gaslighting that we do, that we need to protect this political system as it is the thing to defend. And I think, as Gabriella put, that democracy, by its very nature, should be evolutionary. It should evolve with the time and technology and society that we are. And so, I think that you've both set the stage for why this is a constitutional moment. And I think because it speaks to three things which is driving the threat to democracy right now. The collective sense of powerlessness we feel, and a constitution can enshrine and our highest rights, our highest power that we can hold. Our collective sense of hopelessness by practicing that muscle of imagination and building a document that is aspirational and that we can work towards. And the apathy that we all feel for political parties, for politics as usual, by building a democratic system that we want to engage in, that has the possibility, not just, as you said, sortition or citizens' assemblies, but has the possibility of doing that through theatre, through play, and for all the ways that we want to participate in however we've learnt to. But that also poses a challenge, because we're not about to have a constitutional moment in the next couple of years in the UK. We have one of the most centralised governments in the Western world, and the political leaders of this country at the moment aren't going there. So what we do need to do is lean into that tradition that comes from the outside, because constitutions have to have that buy-in from inside government for them to work. So what we need to do is a People's Charter. We need to build it together to stretch and build that muscle of political imagining, so that we can pave the way for a constitution in the future, but we can also pave the way for that scaffolding for all of us to participate in a democracy that works. Thank you.
Thank you, my friends. I believe we're down here. We're able to be down here for drinks for a little bit longer. The third floor is also open if you would like. Thank you so much for coming. Please do come again. Good night.